They don't ask because they're curious. They ask because they're unsettled. Every time you move with precision, without external validation, without the usual stutter most people need to feel seen, it shakes their foundation. They ask, how do you know? Not because they want the map, but because they never built a compass of their own. They were taught to follow blueprints, to wait for applause, to second-guess every instinct until it was diluted into something socially acceptable. You didn't. You moved when your gut shifted. You spoke when your silence was done serving you. And now they stare, baffled, not by the result, but by the source. They're not confused by what you did. They're confused by how you dared to do it without their input. You became unreadable, and unreadable people threaten fragile systems. They're used to people broadcasting their pain, narrating their progress, performing their growth in digestible captions. You didn't. You went internal. You studied. You absorbed. And when the time came, you acted, not to impress, but to align. That's what they can't mimic. Intuition cannot be copied. Inner knowing cannot be taught to those who outsource their identity. And so they ask, over and over, how do you know? As if the secret was a tactic. As if the answer could be downloaded, processed, and reapplied. What they don't realize is the answer isn't in a sentence. The answer is in everything you endured in silence. Everything you dismantled in yourself. Everything you risked when no one was clapping. Their confusion is your proof. You didn't just change. You changed in a way they can't track. That's why they're stuck. Because they knew the old you. The one who over-explained. Who doubted herself every step. Who mistook approval for direction. But that version died, quietly. And the new you walk like the room is already yours. Because it is. Not because they said so, but because you built yourself to no longer ask. That unshakable internal certainty reads like arrogance to people who don't recognize what self-respect looks like when it finally matures. You're not trying to convince anyone anymore. You already know. What they don't grasp is that your knowing wasn't born from ego. It was born from being broken so deeply that the only way to survive was to develop a sense for truth that couldn't be faked. You don't know because you read more. You know because you felt more. You bored. You failed. You watched people smile while sabotaging you. And through it all, something ancient woke up inside you. A sense. A signal. A way of reading rooms, faces, energies that no school teaches. You stopped needing signs because you became the signal. And they hate that. Because it means you don't need their insights to move like thunder. You weren't chasing insight. You were surviving. And in survival, the senses sharpen. You can smell lies now. You can hear betrayal in casual tones. You can feel envy hidden in compliments. So when they ask, how do you know? They're really asking why they can't hide from you. Why their tricks don't land anymore. Why their manipulations don't provoke the old version of you. And you won't say it, but the answer is simple. You lived too much pain to not recognize patterns. You spent too much time in the dark to not know where the cracks form. That's the cost of becoming someone who moves like prophecy. You don't explain your moves because they were never built for consensus. They were built in isolation, forged in loss, sharpened through humiliation. That kind of wisdom doesn't sound poetic when you live it. It sounds like crying alone and still showing up the next day. It sounds like forgiving yourself for believing in liars. It sounds like choosing growth over vengeance, even when vengeance would feel better. And when you make your next move and they whisper, how did they know to do that? You won't look back, because there are no blueprints for how you arrived here. Only blood trails and buried versions of yourself that made the current one inevitable. You don't owe them transparency. People who demanded access to your chaos don't deserve insight into your clarity. Let them guess. Let them project. Let them theorize over your stillness like it's a strategy. Meanwhile, you'll be outgrowing questions that no longer hold weight. You don't walk into rooms to be understood. You walk in to see who's aligned and who's still pretending. And when you sense the tension, because they feel you before you speak, you smile. Not out of arrogance, but because you remember when their questions used to shake you. Now, they only confirm what you already knew. You were never lost. You were just surrounded by people too afraid to move without permission. They'll call it luck, or timing, or guesswork. because admitting it was intuition would require them to admit they ignored their own. They'll say you got it right, like it was a lottery ticket. But you know better. You didn't get it right. You aligned with what was already yours. You removed distractions. You sat with yourself longer than they could sit with silence. You paid attention, not to trends, not to noise, but to the truth that always echoed underneath your fear. And that truth, it became your guide. That's what they see now. A person who moves like their soul is the compass. That's what scares them. Not what you know, but how deeply you trust what you know. Even now, they're hoping for cracks. They think your silence means hesitation, that your detachment is a glitch. But you're not frozen, you're calculating. You're watching how the room breathes. You're measuring intentions without needing anyone to speak. And when you move again with that same clean precision, they'll ask again, how do they keep doing this? And you still won't answer, because answering would make it seem like there's a formula. And there isn't. There's only this: you went deeper than they were willing to. You healed in places they haven't dared to look. And now you live where their questions can't follow. They expected rage. Doors slammed, public humiliation, a declaration of war so loud it would echo through social circles and stain their name permanently. They expected fire and fury because that's the only language they speak. They operate in explosions. Their entire method relies on chaos, spectacle, emotional erosion. But you didn't give them that. You didn't even give them a whisper. You gave them absence, and that's what ruined them, because fire can be fought, fury can be defended. But absence, that's a ghost you can't chase. It's silence that haunts their thoughts because it doesn't end. It doesn't resolve. It lingers. You didn't disappear to be mysterious. You disappeared to preserve your sanity. And while they stood ready, armor strapped, combats rehearsed, you stepped off the battlefield. You didn't surrender. You made the war irrelevant. That's why they still talk about you. That's why they keep poking indirectly, hoping to provoke a spark. But the version of you they built this drama for, that version packed her bags and left the stage with her head high. They prepared for a fight. You gave them freedom. And that's the one thing they never wanted. Because a fight means they still matter. Absence means they don't. They mistook your restraint for weakness. They assumed your silence was fear. But the truth was sharper. You saw how low they were willing to go, and you simply refused to crawl. You realized revenge that requires your energy is just another way of keeping yourself bound to them. You weren't interested in poetic justice. You were interested in healing. And healing rarely comes with applause. It comes with discipline. The kind that makes you delete drafts. The kind that stops you from retaliating when you know your words would land like knives. You didn't hold back because you couldn't destroy them. You held back because they weren't worth your destruction. People who thrive on control are allergic to being ignored. They don't fear confrontation, they fear irrelevance. So when you chose absence, you stripped them of their favorite weapon, attention. No closure. No reaction. No explanation. Just vacancy. That's what eats at them now. They don't know how to frame your silence. They can't defend themselves against a ghost. And every time they look around, expecting you to snap, to stumble, to prove their version of you correct, all they find is a void where you used to be. Not hiding, not broken, just gone. You didn't just disappear. You evolved. And they know it. They can feel it in the way your name no longer carries the same weight in conversations. In the way their stories about you fall flat, because the updated version of you contradicts every lie they told. They thought you'd come back wounded. You didn't. You came back wiser, cleaner, detached. They don't recognize this new you. And they can't connect to someone who no longer needs their recognition. That's what absence does. It starves their ego while feeding your soul. You didn't retreat, you ascended. And from that altitude, their drama looks small. You could crush it with a sentence, but you won't. Not because you lack the words, but because they no longer deserve the clarity. You saw what they did. You remember the manipulation, the subtle jabs, the gaslighting wrapped in fake concern. You've archived every betrayal, but you refused to let it define your path forward. They wanted you to live in retaliation. You chose peace, and that choice rewrote the narrative entirely. They still wait for you to lose control. That's the only way they can win. If you react, they get to play innocent again. But you've grown past that. You don't swing at shadows. You don't argue with people who twist logic. You don't correct those who misrepresent you. You simply live. Fully. Boldly. Quietly. And your absence from their games is what keeps them spinning. They lost their grip on your emotions, and with it their power. The worst part for them. You never announced your departure. You just stopped showing up. No warning. No farewell. Just a clean break. And that subtlety wounded deeper than any monologue ever could. Because now they're left explaining your silence to others who also noticed. And the more they talk, the clearer it becomes that they're spinning. You gave them nothing, and somehow that nothing is louder than their noise. That's the brilliance of absence. It echoes without sound. You didn't choose absence to hurt them. You chose it to heal you. But healing, when done right, has collateral consequences. It reveals who depended on your wounds to feel powerful. It exposes those who needed your dysfunction to feel functional. And when that fuel disappeared, they were left confronting their own void. That's what they really resent. Not your silence, but what your silence says about them. They expected fire. They deserved it. But you gave them something worse. Indifference. You stopped making them the center of your story. You took your energy back, your presence, your voice, and the vacuum you left behind. It still roars. Not because you burned bridges, but because you walked away while they were still pouring gasoline. They planned for combustion. You offered stillness. And in that stillness they saw their reflection. Clear. Unavoidable. And for the first time they had to sit with it. They hoped the silence meant hesitation. That maybe you were wrestling with whether or not to confront them, whether or not to forgive them. But you weren't. You were already elsewhere. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually. The part of you that once needed their apology had already died from dehydration. They never watered you. They studied you, mimicked care, simulated affection, but you always knew something was missing. That's why when you walked away, it wasn't with relief. You had finally aligned your external world with what your intuition had whispered for months. That they were never going to change. That they would never take responsibility unless it was convenient. So you left, not because you were done talking, because talking to them was done serving your evolution. They misinterpreted your silence as a pause in the narrative. They thought the story was unfinished. But the story didn't pause. It concluded. You just didn't write them into the ending. You stopped casting them as a villain to defeat or a lover to redeem. You simply erased them. And that, more than anything, infuriated them. Because people who manipulate don't fear consequences, they fear irrelevance. They fear not being remembered. They fear not being able to twist the narrative one last time. But you never gave them a final scene. You didn't walk away in dramatic fashion. You walked away like it was just another Tuesday. No tears, no slammed doors, just the click of emotional detachment that now echoes louder than any goodbye ever could. They keep looking for a flaw in your silence. They convince themselves it's a strategy, a delayed counterattack, a phase. Because acknowledging that you genuinely let go would mean acknowledging that their power was never real. It was borrowed. From your empathy or guilt, your desire to be understood. Once you no longer needed that, the entire structure crumbled, and they're still trying to rebuild it on old blueprints that no longer match your architecture. They don't understand that the absence wasn't about disappearing. It was about becoming someone they no longer had the tools to manipulate. You didn't become heartless. You just became inaccessible. Your absence became presence elsewhere, in peace, in clarity, in building things that didn't require you to shrink. You stopped chasing people who made you feel like too much. You stopped explaining emotions to those who used them as weapons. And you started investing in stillness, in growth that doesn't clap for itself, in relationships where silence feels safe, not loaded. That's why they're still stuck in loops while you've changed timelines. They stayed in the theater waiting for Act 3. You left, walked into the real world, and never looked back. That was re-entry into your own life on your own terms. And now, even your absence has weight. Rooms shift when your name is mentioned, not because of what you did, but because of how little you needed to do. They can't forget you, not because you made a scene, but because you made a decision. One that didn't require witnesses. One that didn't require drama. Just a quiet, final breath of self-respect. You became the lesson they never thought they'd be forced to learn. That the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And your absence didn't scream, didn't mourn. It simply stopped showing up. And that was the most devastating sound of all.
They needed numbers to feel brave, to weaponize whispers into thunder, to disguise insecurity as alliance. You didn't realize it at first. You thought you were the problem. You overanalyzed every word, tried harder, softened more, made yourself smaller just to fit into spaces that secretly resented your presence. They fed each other lies about you because none of them had the courage to face what you reflected back at them, their own cowardice. But you weren't built to break under collective pressure. You were built to observe, to listen, to survive without needing retaliation. And when you didn't fold like they planned, when you didn't beg or perform or fall apart on cue, they misread it as weakness. But what they were watching was calculation. They underestimated the silent ones, the ones who don't seek revenge, but become it. You didn't shout. You didn't expose. You didn't try to convince anyone of your side. That's what made your response lethal. Because you didn't need a crowd, you needed clarity. And with that clarity, you stepped out of the game completely. Left them playing chess against themselves, each move exposing how shallow their alliances were. They built a house of mirrors to trap your image, but forgot that reflections don't fight back. They reveal. And now, one by one, they're realizing that unity built on resentment can't stand. That a circle for good and gossip is a ticking clock. That while they were celebrating your silence as defeat, you were simply watching, documenting, and outlasting. People always show you who they are when they think you have no power. That's the trick. And they showed you everything, their fear, their envy, their need to control what they can't become. But instead of reacting, you adapted. You cut ties without theatrics. You learned to smile in rooms where your name was being dissected. That was your edge. You didn't need to defend. You let your composure be the contradiction. And that composure, that became unbearable. Because billies don't know what to do when the target doesn't panic, when the person they try to erase starts glowing instead. So now they're unraveling, slowly, separately, because you were never the common enemy. You were the common mirror, and mirrors don't lie. The ones who threw dirt at your name are now buried beneath the weight of their own insecurity. Not because you exposed them, but because life did.